Well, good morning. Welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. This morning we have, as a special treat, welcoming back Katherine Paterson to her alma mater yet again. You are going to have a couple other opportunities to encounter Katherine during your time here. I want to mention those briefly to begin with. Following the reading this morning, we're going to go down to the world premiere, although it's not officially the world premiere, of Katherine and Stephanie's play Good King Wenceslas at the Paramount, produced by King. That'll be on again tomorrow night and then twice on Saturday. Katherine and Stephanie will be at the performance this morning, and they'll be at the performance tomorrow night of the play. Also, if you want to spend some time, we have some time with them this afternoon at the Bristol Public Library. This will be from 4 to 5 this afternoon in the Kegley Room at the Bristol Public Library, and that is open to everybody. So please do feel free to join us for that. Catherine commented as we came into the building this morning that this is one of the few buildings still here from her time as a student. King's campus has changed a little bit since 1954, but this building has been here for quite a while. She graduated from King after growing up in China. From here, she taught school for a while. She went and did a master's degree in Richmond and then went as a missionary to Japan. Returning from Japan, she came back, met her husband John, who is a Presbyterian minister, and they moved from parish to parish around the eastern seaboard, more or less, finally landing in Vermont, which is where she lives today. Along the way, she started to write for children, and her career as an author for children has been highly decorated. Among the many, many novels and books, 2 have won the National Book Award, 2 have won the Newbery Medal, and she's been given a number of career awards, the Hans Christian Andersen Award, the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, and the Library of Congress declared her a living legend. So she's got a list of awards a mile long, and yet for us, she is also an old friend and someone we are just glad to see every time she comes back to Bristol. It's a delight to have her this morning to read from her memoir. Catherine's memoir is called Stories from My Life. We do have a few copies here if you want one, and we won't have time to sign them this morning because I've got to get her to the theater, but she will be at the library later on. Stories from My Life is a reissue, and it covers this interesting set of circumstances and characters and places that Katherine has been in her characteristic style, full of warmth and wit and faith. It's a wonderful volume, and she's a wonderful human being. We're glad to have her back. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Paterson.
I'm delighted to be back and glad to see all of you and to meet new friends. I won't tell you all the steps and missteps I took from the stage as a student and the years that I've come back as an alumna, some of them more glorious than others. And those of you who remember the speech that I made, the most memorable speech that I made because of the huge faux pas in it, will never forget it, and I will not repeat it today. Sorry about that. I always swore I'd never write a memoir because I don't have that good a memory. And okay, is this better? Sorry. You know, I have a notebook in which I keep my speeches, and in the front of it, there's a note from my husband, who died 9 years ago, but the note was, "Do you have water? Is the mic adjusted? I love you." Well, the mic was definitely not adjusted, and I would have seen my husband on the back row waving and saying, so Martin had to do it for me today. Anyhow, where I was saying I was never going to write a memoir because I didn't have a good memory. And besides, I didn't think the people that I loved most wanted to be minor characters in the story of my life. So many of the major characters in my life don't even appear in the book because the book is sort of just stories I like to tell. And that way I could tell stories that I want to tell, and you don't have to know the ones I don't want to tell. So it's not a tell-all. But I started out with 3 questions that I'm most frequently asked. And today I'm going to focus on the 3rd question because it's one that worries me an awful lot today. I go to, before COVID, believe me, I went to schools a good bit where young people were reading my books. And a question that I kept getting from kids that really worried me was, well, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but I want to be famous. And I thought, what have we taught our children that they're not worth anything unless they see themselves on television or read about themselves somewhere? And so I began to think about, because they would say to me then, how does it feel to be famous? Well, after Martin reads this list of things that are supposed to make me feel famous, I dare to read my answer to how does it feel to be famous. The questioner is young and earnest and has just confided that although she doesn't know what she wants to be, she knows she wants to be famous. I don't really know how to answer her question. How does it feel to be famous? And then I remember things that happened after Bridge to Terabithia won the Newbery Medal. I would be invited somewhere to speak, and there would be a lovely dinner at which I was the honored guest. The people on either side of me at the table would say something gracious and congratulatory, and then they would turn to the person on the other side and never speak to me again for the whole meal. There were a few times when the person in charge made it clear that she'd hired me for the weekend and expected to get her money's worth, by gum. I'd come home and whine to my long-suffering husband, I'm a human being, I'd say. Why can't they just treat me like a human being? And then I remembered Anita. When I was in Chandler Junior High in Richmond, Virginia, all of us new kids were put in the same homeroom. It was a wonderful thing because we could make friends with each other. We didn't have to try to cope with the already cemented friendships that in the rest of the school. I made several good friends that year, but there was one new girl that we were all shy around. The reason we were shy around Anita was because she was famous. She was the youngest member of the Carter sisters. Her mother, Maybelle, had been part of the legendary country music group, the Carter Family. Her older sister, June, went on to marry Johnny Cash. At the time, her mother, 2 older sisters, and Anita sang regularly on the radio and in concerts all over the South. We didn't make friends with her because we didn't know what to say to someone we considered famous. Because she had moved around the country a lot, Anita needed catching up on a couple of subjects. And for some reason, I was asked to tutor her. To my amazement, she was so shy that even one-on-one, she barely spoke above a whisper. Yet that summer, I went to a concert at the stadium, and on stage, Anita was transformed. The huge crowd loved her, and she obviously loved performing for them. If it is hard for me at 45 to deal with a little bit of fame that I have. How must it have been for Anita, I wondered. So I wrote Come Sing Jimmy Joe about James, a shy boy who becomes a star. If you want to know what Katherine Paterson is really like, you should read that book. Like James, and perhaps Anita, I'm a shy show-off, a very private person who loves to perform. When my friend Nancy Graff read this section on feeling famous, she said, "Oh, come on, Katherine. You know you get a kick out of being famous." We both laughed because, of course, I do like the perks. I mean, I was thrilled to be introduced to the Empress of Japan and hear her say, "Katherine Paterson, who wrote Bridge to Terabithia?" Sometimes I can't believe my own life. I find myself standing on a stage or sitting at a table with writers I have known and admired for many years, really famous people, and think, this is me here with these amazing people. But that doesn't mean I feel famous. Famous is not an emotion like love or hate or jealousy or fear, feelings with which I am well acquainted. You can't feel it, but you can learn over the years to sit back and enjoy some of the perks. My special friend in Tacoma Park, Maryland, was Jean Nimovich. Jean was an established writer when I first met her, and I had just published my first book. Jean stood by me in my triumphs, just as she would through my troubles, and always with a wonderful sense of humor. Soon after the first Newbery, I was scheduled to give a speech that I knew had to be a good one, since it seemed to me that almost every important children's writer and critic on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean was going to be in the audience. We were on vacation at Lake George, so I sent the speech to Jean for her to comment on and revise accordingly. But I was still anxious. I called her and told her that she'd just have to pray for me, as I was afraid I was going to fall apart. Jean, a devout Roman Catholic, promised she'd pray, but told me to calm down. It would be fine, and it was. After I got back to Lake George, I called her to tell her it had gone all right and thanked her for her prayers. If I'd known how efficacious Roman Catholic prayers were, I said jokingly, I might have converted long ago. Well, I did pray, she said, and he said, "Katherine who?" When I moved to Vermont, Jean got in touch with Grace Green, a friend I made soon after moving, and told her that as long as I had been in Maryland, and even previously in Virginia, she'd been able to keep me humble. But Vermont was just too far away. So she was turning the job over to Grace. I wondered if Grace had taken her assignment too much to heart when she told me this story. A small group of us gathered periodically to do pastel painting, and the night of January the 5th, 2010, I was missing. Grace had gotten an invitation, so she knew that I was in Washington being presented as the new National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. But when the others asked where I was, Grace said, "She's in Washington being made a national embarrassment." Since real friends like mine are more precious than awards, I know I am truly blessed, and gratitude, unlike fame, is something you can actually feel. Now, of course, people want to know what went into making me as a writer, And my friend Jane Boyd, who graduated, who's much younger than I, but we were at King at the same time, said last night, I said, I'm trying to decide what I should read tomorrow, because the book that had all the places where I thought I might read today was left at home because I bought a new copy of the book. Oh, well, I got here. And she said, well, you have to read the story about the Peninsula Hotel, which she'd heard me read before, or tell before anyhow. And so last night I went back and found the place in the book, which in Jane's honor, Jane is sitting right there, and is a wonderful friend. That's one thing that school gives you, that when you get old like me, it's hard to find friends that you're going to have for the rest of your life, and the rest of your life is not going to be so long anyhow. But Jane has been my friend since the 50s, so I guess she's my friend of longest standing in this room. I was born in China, and my parents were Presbyterian missionaries, Southern Presbyterian missionaries at the time. And my first few years were idyllic. As a tiny child, secure in the love of my parents and the Chinese friends who lived in the compound that was home in Huai'an, I was blissfully unaware of the things that were happening beyond our gate. But I was to understand all too well by my fifth birthday. We had gone to the Mount Resort the summer of 1937 and were caught there when the war with Japan began in earnest that July. Even with the cold weather fast approaching, it was too dangerous for the family to travel, so only my father was allowed to go home. After 5 frightening months of air raids, news of battles and atrocities, not knowing what was happening to our beloved father, he finally returned. In late January 1938, we began our journey out of China. For vacationers, whether Chinese or foreign, there was only one way to get up or down the thousands of stone steps that were the path to the top of the mountain. You rode in a sedan chair carried by 2 strong men. But this trip was only taken in the summertime. It was January by now, and the thousands of steps dug into the edge of the mountain were coated with ice. It was only the sure-footed skill of those carriers that got all the stranded foreigners down that precipitous route without a tragedy. I'm sure no one breathed easily until all the chairs were safely at the foot of the mountain. There we caught a river steamer to take us to the city of Hangzhou, where we boarded a specially designated train covered with large red crosses. We traveled from central China all the way south to British-ruled Hong Kong. Now, the 7 of us, which made up our family, had spent a week on the journey. And on the evacuation train, we were crowded into a single 4th-class sleeping compartment where we both ate and slept. My sister Helen was not quite 2, and baby Anne was less than 5 months old. I'm still wondering what my mother did about diapers. Once we arrived, the British authorities had no idea what to do with this trainload of foreign refugees. So while the fathers were out scouring the crowded city for reasonably priced shelter, the mothers and children just sat on their luggage in the vast lobby of the Peninsula Hotel, which was then and may still be the grandest of all Hong Kong's grand hotels. Naturally, the elegant British, European, and American tourists who had paid hundreds of pounds for the privilege of staying in the peninsula were appalled and offended by this filthy lot of women and children who were cluttering up their lobby. My mother, who was not a bitter woman, could not recall that long day without bitterness. I watched them as they passed by with sneers on their faces, and I wanted to cry out to them, "Do you think I like being here? Do you think I want my children to be dirty?" She would shake her head. "They couldn't even smile at the baby," she said. "What kind of person can't even smile at a baby?" And she would always end the story by saying, "I can never see a picture of refugees in the paper without remembering how it feels." She later said, "In all the years in China, it was the only time I felt completely sorry for myself." When I told the story to my good friend Mary Sorum, she said, "Oh, that's why you wrote The Day of the Pelican. You remember how it feels to be a refugee." I hadn't really thought about it, but Mary is probably right. The story of the Hadju family escaping the war in Kosovo and coming as refugees to America that had inspired my novel must surely have reminded me of that day in the Peninsula Hotel. We were evacuated twice from China because of World War II. And the second time we were evacuated to the States at the end of 1940, I was glad to be in a country where occupying soldiers didn't run across our front yard or question my parents, where no bombs were falling and our father would come home safely every night. The few months we spent in Lynchburg, where we once again landed on our relatives until we found a tiny apartment nearby, were happy ones for me. But the next fall, we moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I was enrolled in the 4th grade at Calvin H. Wiley Elementary School. The 4th grade was a time of fear and humiliation for me. Nothing I had learned in my previous school seemed to matter in this one. The locker method of handwriting that I had finally caught on to in Lynchburg was invalid in Winston-Salem, where the Palmer method was the only proper system. Spelling using the wrong kind of cursive letters were defaced with large red X's, even when spelled correctly. But worst of all, there was Pansy, the 7th grade bully, who along with her 2 large friends terrorized me on the playground. Since there were no girlfriends to hang out with during recess, I would stand trembling as close to the school building as I could, watching Pansy and her friends coming up toward me from the bottom of the huge playground. "I'm going to report you," she said to me one day. "You're walking on the grass." I looked down at the hard, bare ground under my feet. "There's no grass here," I protested. "Of course not," she said, "because people like you keep walking on it." Now, being reported was like being indicted for a felony. I lived in dread for days. I couldn't tell my parents. They'd gone to my Aunt Katherine's funeral in Lexington. And even after they returned, I couldn't tell them. The disgrace would have been too much for them to bear. Every recess, Pansy would tell me that any moment now, I would be called to the principal's office. One day I was so frightened that I broke into tears in music class. Mr. Obershane, the beautiful music teacher, quietly took me out into the hall and gently asked me what was the matter. I blurted out my crime and Pansy's threat. She didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She simply assured me that I would not be expelled for walking on the imaginary grass. And indeed, she was quite sure I wouldn't even be reprimanded. I should just go to the girls' room and wash my face and come to class when I felt better. I recognize now that some of my best writing has its seeds in that awful year, but I can't remember once saying to my 9-year-old self, "Buck up, old girl. Someday you're going to make a mint out of all this misery." There were, however, a few people that I remember with great fondness from that horrible year. One was, of course, Mrs. Obershane, who not only taught me how to do-re-mi, but also showed me that there were adults who could deeply empathize with a child's irrational fears. Another was the librarian of the Calvin H. Wiley School, who made the library a sanctuary and a source of comfort and delight in an otherwise frightening place. And there was Eugene Hammett, the other weird kid in the 4th grade. Now, at this point, I usually ask how many people in this audience have heard me tell the story of Eugene Hammett? Good, because I have sworn to keep telling it as long as there's not a single hand raised in the audience. So Jane and Stephanie will just have to bear with me while they hear once again the story of Eugene Hammett. Although Eugene and I became friends sometime in the course of that year, there was an important difference between us. I was weird through no choice of my own. I spoke English, as my friends in Shanghai had, with something of a British accent. I could, as I noted, hardly afford lunch, much less clothes, so my classmates would, from time to time, recognize on my back one of their own donations to charity. On December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and because it was known that I had come from that part of the world, there were dark hints that I might be one of them. Eugene, on the other hand, was weird by choice, or mostly by choice. I guess he didn't choose his looks. He was a perfectly round little boy who wore full moon steel-rimmed glasses long before John Lennon made them acceptable, and sported a half-inch blonde brush cut. My only ambition in the 4th grade was to become somehow less weird. Eugene's declared ambition was to become a ballet dancer. In North Carolina, in 1941, little boys, even well-built or skinny little boys, did not want to be ballet dancers when they grew up. Now, sometimes outcasts despise even each other, but Eugene and I did not. We were friends for the rest of the 4th grade and all of the 5th, 6th, and 7th grades. During my public school career, Calvin H. Wiley was the only school I went to for more than a year. And by the time Eugene and I were in the 7th grade, I had fulfilled my modest ambition. I was no longer regarded as particularly weird. Eugene, on the other hand, continued to march, or should I say dance, to a different drummer. We moved the summer after 7th grade. I grew up at last and had a full, rich life in which people loved me and didn't call me names, at least not to my face. But from time to time over the years, I would think of Eugene and worry about him. Whatever could have happened to my chubby little friend whose consuming passion was to become a ballet dancer? After many decades and scene changes, the Paterson family was living in Norfolk, Virginia, and our son David had become, at 17, a serious actor. But in order to get the parts he wanted, he realized that he needed to take dancing lessons. There was, however, a problem. Even in 1983, boys in Norfolk, Virginia did not generally aspire to become ballet dancers. He asked me to find out about lessons he could take without the rest of the soccer team finding out about it. My friend Katherine Morton's daughter took ballet. So I said to Katherine, David needs to take ballet lessons, but he's not eager for all his buddies to know. Do you have any recommendations? Well, said Katherine, if he's really serious, Gene Hammett at Tidewater Ballet is the best teacher anywhere around. Of course, you might find him a bit strange, but wait a minute, I said. Gene who? Hammett, she replied. He sends dancers to the Joffrey New York City Ballet and Alvin Ailey every year. He's especially good with young black dancers. Terribly hard on any kid he thinks has talent, but he'd give his life for them. Gene who? I asked again. Hammett, she said. You may have seen him around town. He's enormous and wears great flowing caftans. He does look a bit weird, but he's a wonderful teacher. You don't happen to know where he came from? Well, he came here from New York. New York? He wasn't a dancer. Oh, yes, he was quite good in his time. You wouldn't know it by looking at him now. But he was a fine dancer 20, 30 years ago. You wouldn't happen to know where he grew up. Oh, I don't know. She said North Carolina somewhere, I think. Next time you see him, would you ask him if he remembers anyone named Katherine Wummeldorf from Calvin H. Wiley School? Some days later, the phone rang. Katherine, said an unknown male voice. This is Gene Hammett. Eugene, do you remember me? I even remember a joke you told me in the 4th grade. I asked you why, if you were born in China, you weren't Chinese. And you said, if a cat's born in a garage, does it make it an automobile? And what about you? You danced in New York, and now you're a famous teacher of ballet? It's hard to imagine. You were a little round boy when I knew you. He laughed. Well, he said, now I'm a big round man. I saw Eugene a number of times after that, and he was a big round man. But I also saw pictures of him leaping like Baryshnikov from the boards of a New York stage. And even if I miss knowing him when he was slim and gorgeous and at the height of his career, I wouldn't give anything for knowing that it happened as he had determined it would back there when we were both weird little 9-year-olds at Calvin H. Wiley School. I've tried a couple of times to put Eugene into a novel, but I've found that you can't put real people into books. Characters in books have to be believable. And real people, especially people like Eugene, simply aren't believable. I did try to put Pansy, the 7th grade bully, into Bridge to Terabithia. It was going to be the perfect revenge for all those terrifying recess hours she caused me. But there again, I don't know why Pansy was a bully. And when I knew, I felt sorry for her. Before I finished the book, I rather liked her. It ruined my plan for revenge. I heard somewhere that unless you can find yourself in the villain, he or she will remain a cardboard character. Good advice for fledgling writers, I think. How much time? I got 10 minutes. Okay. Well, all right. If my time at my 4th grade at Calvin H. Wiley School was the unhappiest year of my life, I think the hardest year of my adulthood may have been in 1974, when I turned out to have cancer. Obviously, I lived. Now, children are often afraid of death, and I certainly was as a child. But I was 41 years old now with 4 young children, and it was not only the dread of dying, but the idea of leaving my children behind that I could not bear to imagine. I knew my lovely husband would be fine. There would be women lining up around the block to snatch him the moment I was out of the picture. One of them might turn out to be a better mother than I was. But surely no one, I thought, no one, however fit to replace me, could ever love those children the way I did. Of course, my death would not leave my children alone. They had a loving father and grandparents and aunts and uncles and a whole congregation of people who would care for them. Lynn and John were not only brother and sister, but the closest of friends. Mary had a wonderful teacher with a daughter just Mary's age, who looked after her when I was in the hospital and would, I knew, continue to care for her. And David had Lisa. Lisa had come into our lives the previous autumn. The small school that our children attended was closed, and all the students were moved to a much larger elementary school across town. David, our 2nd grader, was miserable. In the little school, he was both the class artist and the class clown. In his new school, he was simply weird. Every day he came home and declared that he was never, ever going back to that school, and you can't make me. And I, his mother, who had been in 15 different schools by the time I was 18 and had been initially despised at nearly every one, was over-identifying with my 7-year-old, probably exacerbating his misery, but nevertheless getting him up every morning and grimly pushing him out the door, fearing that his unhappiness would never end. Then one afternoon, our bright, funny little boy that I thought was gone forever came running into the house. Me and Lisa Hill are making a diorama of Little House in the Big Woods, he announced cheerfully. I'd never heard the name before, but from then on I was to hear hardly any other name. Now, I'd like to promise you girls, I say when I'm talking to children, that I was thrilled that my son's best friend was a girl. But unfortunately, all I could think was, they thought he was weird before. If his best friend is a girl, he'll never fit in. But then I met Lisa, and my worries evaporated. Anyone would be fortunate to have her for a best friend. She was bright, imaginative, and funny. She laughed at his jokes, and he at hers. She was the only girl daring enough to invade the second-grade boys' t-ball team. She and David played together after school in the woods below her house and talked to each other in the evening on the phone. "It's your old girlfriend, David," his older brother would say. But David would take the phone unperturbed. Girlfriends are people who chase you down on the playground to grab you and kiss you. Lisa was no more a girlfriend than Margaret Thatcher was a Playboy bunny. Then on an August morning, the phone rang. It was a call from the Hill's next-door neighbor. "I thought you ought to know," Mrs. Robinson said, "that Lisa was killed this morning." While the family was on vacation at Bethany Beach, on a day when the lifeguards sensed no danger from thunder off in the distance, a joyful little girl dancing on a rock above the crowded beach was felled by a bolt of lightning from the sky. How was I to make sense of this tragedy for my child? I couldn't make sense of it for myself. So eventually I began to write a story, because I knew that a story has to make sense. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when you get to the end, even if you cannot articulate intellectually what has happened, you know emotionally that you have come from chaos to order. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, "One must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star." And somehow, as dark as life itself sometimes seems, at the end of a well-told story, the dancing star will shed light on the chaos. So I began to write what I could not understand or explain. But when I came to the place in my story, when I knew that if I went to work the next day, I would write the chapter in which Leslie Burke would die, I did the only thing I could do to keep her alive. I didn't go to work. I caught up on my mail. I rearranged my bookshelves. I think I was even reduced to scrubbing the kitchen floor. Anything to keep from writing the fatal chapter. It was just then that I happened to have lunch with a former Richmond classmate. "How's your new book coming?" she asked. Now, no one, as my long-suffering family members know all too well, no one is ever supposed to ask me how my work is coming. But Estelle had known me longer than any of them, and she had no respect. So I blurted out the answer. "I'm trying to write a book about a friendship between a boy and a girl in which the girl dies," I said. "But I can't let her die." I guess, I added, thinking I was very wise, I guess I can't face going through Lisa's death again. Estelle looked me straight in the eyes. "I don't think it's Lisa's death you can't face," she said. "I think it's yours." I knew she was right. If it were Lisa's death I couldn't face, it was one thing. But if it was my death I couldn't face, then I would have to finish the book. I went home that afternoon and with sweat pouring down my arms, wrote the chapter, and in a few days finished the draft. It was the most painful writing I'd ever done, so painful I simply couldn't stand having it in the house. So I did what no real writer would ever do. I mailed the draft to Virginia Buckley before the sweat had evaporated. As soon as I mailed the manuscript, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Every day I expected the letter that would tell me politely, maybe even a little sorrowfully, that I had obviously lost whatever talent I had shown, that my career as a writer was over. Instead, I got a phone call. It was Virginia, saying that she wanted to talk to me about my new manuscript. I stopped breathing. I laughed through the first 2/3, she said, and cried through the last. I began to breathe again. Now, she said, let's turn it into a book. And then she did what I believe the great writers do. She asked me the question that would do just that. Is this, she asked, a story about friendship, or is it a story about death? Until that moment, I had thought I was writing a story about death. Hadn't it been a year of death in our lives? But as soon as she asked the question, I knew I was wrong. Oh, I said, it's a story about friendship. Then you need to go back and write it that way, Virginia went on, to remind me that in any true friendship, both friends change and grow because they know each other. I see how Jesse has changed because he has known Leslie. But I don't see how knowing Jesse has changed Leslie. How has Jessie made a difference in her life? That was the problem that had to be solved to turn my painful little cry of anguish into a real story. And as I pondered it, up from the dust of the playground of Calvin H. Wiley School arose Pansy and her 2 gigantic cohorts who had bullied me when I was in the 4th grade. It would be Pansy, alias Janice Avery, who would show how Jess's friendship enriched Leslie's life. I revised Bridge to Terabithia extensively, and it was published. It was and is a simple story, told in only 128 pages. And the first printing, as I recall, was a modest 7,000 copies. At the time, I wondered if anyone who was not named Paterson would understand it at all. More than 45 years later, I'm still astounded by the response to that book. But here, I want to tell you what it taught me as a writer who was so afraid of mediocrity that she almost didn't dare to become a writer at all. As children, as adolescents, and even I fear as adults, most of us are afraid that if we reveal ourselves as we really are to one another, we will be despised. In writing Bridge to Terabithia, I went into the deepest, darkest regions of myself and offered it to my readers. And my readers through the years have given me the deepest parts of their own souls to my book. Together, we have created a barriers of age and race and religion and nationality, even across language barriers. A deep human connection, which in a world torn apart by divisions, seems miraculous to me. And I thank you.